Welcome to the Geological Society. My name's Nick Billam and I'm Director of Policy and Communications here. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this, the last of the London lectures for 2015, which is entitled Volcanic Activity and the Local Environment. And it's a particular pleasure to welcome today our speaker, Professor Hazel Reimer of the Open University. Now, when we think of volcanoes, we usually think of dramatic pyroclastic flows and lavas. Their local environmental effects, including the destruction of the land surface, are obvious. But persistently active volcanoes, by their very nature, erupt in a regular manner, and their effects over time are not nearly so obvious. For the most part, persistently active volcanoes emit gases rather than rock. High-profile debates and international agreements to reduce anthropogenic carbon dioxide and other pollutants, which are major contributors to the greenhouse effect, have focused attention away from ongoing and uncontrollable volcanic output of these and other gases. However, it is increasingly obvious that the volcanic gas flux is a significant proportion of the total amount of gas passing in and out of our atmosphere. Professor Reimer will talk today about her involvement in an interdisciplinary study based at Masaya Volcano in Nicaragua. This seeks to track and quantify volatile flux from the source magma through the volcanic plume to local environmental sinks in the soil, water, flora and fauna. Hazel Reimer is Dean and Director of Studies in the Faculty of Science at the Open University, where she is Professor of Environmental Volcanology. She has been responsible for developing and championing the use of microgravity as a tool for monitoring active volcanoes, identifying subsurface processes at calderas in a state of unrest, and at persistently active volcanoes. This has provided considerable insight into the range of mechanisms responsible for initiating and sustaining volcanic activity. The techniques which Hazel has pioneered have become the standard for gravity monitoring volcanoes and remain the only way to quantify subsurface mass changes occurring before, during and after eruptions. Active in the Geological Society over many years, a former member of Council and Secretary for Foreign and External Affairs, Professor Reimer is also well known for her outreach activities and for her pioneering citizen science initiatives, and is a fantastic science communicator, as you're about to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Hazel Reimer.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Nick. And since you've said so much about what I'm going to talk about, we can probably just take questions immediately now. Okay, so without further ado, volcanic activity and the local environment. I'm going to talk about Mosiah in Nicaragua, as Nick said. But before I do need to give you the cast of actually, this is just part of a cast of hundreds of people who have helped me along the way in Mosiah, and there are even people in the audience who have done the same too. So these are collaborators, colleagues, and PhD students who have worked with me. So like any scientific endeavour, it is not a solitary thing. One person gets to explain the work to you, but it involves an awful lot of people in pretty much every case. So I'm going to talk about, well, first of all, what on earth do volcanoes have to do with climate? And then look at the local environment. And I hope to explain to you that why Mosiah is not the only place to do this work, but a fantastic one to do it at. And I hope to share just a little bit of my enthusiasm for this wonderful volcano, and then talk about what next. So, well, what on earth do volcanoes have to do with the price of fish? Well, if you think about a volcano, you would normally think it's a big pointy peak. Stuff comes out the top, and sometimes red stuff pours down the sides. If it's going to come out of the top here and it's going to make some big global impact, you need a large explosive eruption, and much of the stuff that comes out actually will be water and carbon dioxide and things like that, but there will also be particulates, ash, and ash is simply broken up, pulverized little bits of rock. That tends to fall out quite fast, but some of these gases will go up a lot further, and it depends entirely on how explosive the eruption is. The more explosive it is, basically, the further up the stuff will go. And the further up it goes, the longer it is likely to stay there. Once it goes stratospheric, it can then go global. And it is then that you start to have global impact from an eruption. Now, if only it were easy and you could say, well, you have this large explosive eruption and therefore you will get global warming, or have this large explosive eruption and therefore you get global cooling. If only. It doesn't work quite like that. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on, well, how explosive it was and therefore how high the materials have gone. It depends on the latitude of the eruption, because that tells you, or that dictates the wind speed and so on. And it also, of course, depends on the season, because that also dictates the wind speed. So there are a lot of variables interplaying here. And of course, it depends on how long the eruption goes on for, how significant the impact is. But very broadly, sorts of things that can happen is you get sulfur dioxide, H2S, various things, going up there, forming aerosol, little particles, and then these can have various effects. Initially, actually you can get a bit like a greenhouse effect. So you get this blanket here, and it just keeps you warm underneath for a period of time. After a little bit longer, the impact is one of cooling, because what you're doing is providing a barrier to prevent the sun coming through. And the length of time of each of these processes depends on the composition of the explosion, the duration of the explosion, the longitude and the latitude of the activity, and so on. So there are a lot of very complicated factors going on here. So far too hard for me to study. So I'm interested in something that's actually at first sight a bit less glamorous, but it's the quiet volcanoes, or quiescent as we've got here, where they don't even seem to be erupting at all, but they are putting out prodigious amounts of gas, not day by day necessarily, but if you add it up for a persistently active volcano that is just doing it day in, day out, the total amounts of material that are erupted are comparable to those rather more glamorous eruptions and explosions that you will have heard about. And it's something of a poor relation in terms of being studied, because it only impacts relatively local environment. So obviously something like the 2010 eruption of Eyjafjallajökull, the Icelandic eruption, who was not affected in some way by that eruption? Yeah, everybody feels that they were impacted in some way. You were either stranded in some glorious place, and so no sympathy, obviously, but everybody was impacted in some way or another, even if it was that you couldn't buy green beans in Sainsbury's for a little while. There was some impact or another, or you knew somebody that was impacted. That was a relatively small eruption, but it had quite a big effect. There are plenty of other large eruptions that have had a global impact, and you know they hit the news every year or two. There is something like that. But there are many, many, many more volcanoes just quietly degassing away, and we have really very little idea either of how much material, gases, are coming out of these things, or what the impact is. And that's what I'm interested in looking at. So just sticking with the relatively big stuff for the time being, Pinatubo erupted in 1991. I'm sure you will remember that. I hate giving a talk like this when you go to schools, because you say, you remember 1991, Pinatubo, and they look at you because obviously it's prehistoric, or pre their history. So Pinatubo, I'm guessing most of you will remember that eruption. The figures vary a little bit depending on who you ask, but millions and millions of tons of SO2 went up into the stratosphere, and they went global. They went right around, and because this was one of the first eruptions that was really well monitored in terms of its environmental impact, we can see here the winter anomalous temperatures. So we know what the temperature would have been expected to be at each point of the globe. And so these are anomalies, and you can see that it gets hot and cold, depending on where you are. So up in Northern Europe, you can see that it's slightly red. And so the winter in Northern Europe was slightly warmer than, well, sorry, Britain. Where are we? Oh, this part here was slightly warmer than had been expected. The effect later on was one of cooling, and overall the effect was cooling for over a degree for a period of a couple of years. Of course, part of the problem is there are other things forcing our temperatures as well, so it's very difficult just to separate out the volcanic anomaly, but the consensus is that there was a slight cooling for a couple of years. Okay, so that's it. And it put in millions of tons of SO2 into the stratosphere. You'll have heard of many of these volcanoes: Etna, Sakurajima, probably, Kilauea, Stromboli. Each of these is persistently active to some extent, and like everything in geology, when you try and talk about a continuous process, when you actually get down to the nitty-gritty, it's not continuous. It's like plate tectonics. We know that plates move apart a couple of centimetres a year on average. People say, well, it's about the same rate as your hair grows or your fingernails grow, but those do sort of tend to grow pretty constantly. Plate tectonics happens a big bit, and then it sits around doing nothing for a long time, and then another big bit. And similarly, with something like a persistently active volcano, where it sounds like it ought to be doing it all of the time, actually it doesn't. There are these cycles, and it has cycles of slightly enhanced activity and slightly lower activity. So when you start talking about the estimated flux of gas from one of these volcanoes, that is the amount of gas coming out, you can put a number here, but it might very well not be the number that you would measure today or yesterday, but it was a measurement at some point. But you can see there's some variability here. But the interesting one here, Mosiah in Nicaragua has tens and then sometimes hundreds of tons of SO2 per day. And that happens most of the time. It goes up and down, but there's quite a lot of it. So, where is this place? Well, let's go to Central America, and we go to this tiny triangular-shaped country, Nicaragua, and it's got a line of volcanoes here, and they simply form part of the Pacific Ring of Fire. You would expect volcanoes there. It's got them. It's got 7 volcanoes, and Mosiah is number 2. And when we home in on it, it doesn't look very much like a volcano at all. It's not a great big pointy peak, as you would probably expect most of the volcanoes on the Pacific Ring of Fire to be. It's a basaltic volcano rather than andesitic. Central America is a little bit anomalous compared with much of the rest of the Pacific Ring of Fire. It's got a relatively thin lithosphere that the volcanoes are built on there. And instead of a big pointy peak, it's actually a hole. And it's called a caldera, and it's this shape. So it's dipped down slightly at one end. So we've got a lake here, and this bit's dry, but this whole thing makes up the volcano. And the currently active crater, you can see that that's currently active, partly because it's got an arrow saying so, but partly because you've got a little plume of gas that you can just about make out there. And I hope you can also see, this is the prevailing wind direction, and you can see bits of vegetation. I'll show you some of the vegetation in a bit more close-up in a moment, but you can see there's a bit less of the vegetation just in that direction, which is a hint that perhaps there's a bit of a local effect there on what's going on. So if we look at the gas that is coming out of Mosiah, again, this is just a snapshot, but in terms of the relative percentages, it won't change very much. Most of the gas plume coming out of Mosiah is water. It's the same for most volcanoes. Very much less, but CO2, And there is an awful lot of those things in the atmosphere anyway, of course, and that does make it then rather difficult to actually measure them. So we tend to focus on SO2 because it is easier to measure. So it's actually quite a small fraction of what comes out of the volcano, but it's the thing that we can measure. And from that, if we know the relative percentages of some of the other gases, then we can work out how much mass altogether is coming out of the volcano. Now, I mentioned that it was somewhat cyclic, so there are periods of more intense degassing and periods of lower degassing. And these are two shots taken from pretty much the same place, looking across the active crater at Mosiah. And you can see the top one was taken in 1994. And although the volcano was very much active, and I'll show you a picture of what it looked like when you look down the hole in a moment, it doesn't look very much. The recent picture, 2015, we took earlier this year, actually you can hardly see anything because it's just full of gas. And I feel really sorry actually for the tourists who come here in their buses, look down into the hole, and they don't have gas masks either. So they can't see and can't breathe either. Not really very nice, but the point is it changes quite a lot. It changes day to day, but more significantly, it changes on over a period of years. And one of the problems is that humans have a fantastic capacity for remembering trivia over decades, but really important things like how active the volcano was over a period of months or years, are much less good at remembering. Masaya, we know, has had 5 major degassing periods. It's had lots of other cycles and so on, but it's had 5 big periods of degassing in the last few hundred years. It probably had lots and lots of cycles before that, but we know a lot less about those because nobody wrote them down. When the conquistadors went and started throwing people into the crater, actually I think people that were there before were throwing people into the crater too, but the conquistadors did a bit of that too. And they started talking about the sort of activity that they saw down into the crater. But anything before that, we can only tell from the geological record, not from written records. So what does it look like when you're around there? Well, there's a lot of agriculture there, and coffee grows variously depending on the state of the degassing. There are a lot of vines of different types are growing there. Pineapples grow quite well. And this is typically what it looks like. So it's a bit of forested area that's been cleared. And much of the time, you would expect the area to look something like this. Some trees. You see a lot of trees over here on the wall of the caldera here, and a cultivated area. You can see some bananas here and coffee underneath. And some shrubs and so on growing there. You come back another year and it doesn't look quite so healthy, does it? This stuff is VOG. It's volcanic gases. And the trees are a lot less happy. Many of them have gone. And really the only stuff that is doing very well is the grasses. I'll show you some more detail about that sort of thing in a moment. So again, back into the what you should be seeing is pretty healthy, if exotic, looking trees. And the understory here is quite impressive, a good variety of plants, and particularly these pinguini things. They're related to pineapples, horrible spiky things, but tough as old boots. They grow anywhere. They don't even need soil. It seems they seem to grow straight out of rock almost. But when you're just downwind of the volcano, this is the sort of thing you would be much more likely to see. So again, these spiky things, but principally grasses. So there clearly is, well, I say there's clearly an impact from the volcano. There is, and it seems to be worse in just this narrow, relatively narrow area downwind of the volcano. But there are all sorts of other things going on. So there are fires that are deliberately set by people and deforestation going on, so there are a lot of variables, and it is quite hard to separate out the two effects. One other special thing about Mosiah is one of the craters. So you may remember from the earlier picture, there's an active crater, and there's two other craters that aren't currently active, all within this large caldera. And San Fernando Crater, which is right next to the active crater, but upwind of it, is very well vegetated. It last erupted a few hundred years ago, and all of these trees are growing just fine because they're just down inside the crater, and they don't get the nasty gases. And we have found a unique butterfly species in that crater. It's found nowhere else. So it's a really, really special place. So what about this volcano? So every now and then it puts more gas out than some other times. It's not explosively eruptive. Even when there are small explosions, it literally it's throat clearing. It chucks out some rocks from the crater. They land, unfortunately, down on the car park and around there. But it's not going stratospheric at all. It's very much local. And once it's done that, you get more of these gases coming out. The gases go up, they combine with the water in the atmosphere and come back down again quite rapidly as acid rain. And the effect of that is, you can see the huge damage here on coffee leaves. Now, coffee leaves grow and they can get damaged like this, and the plant can survive that, providing it's not a persistent problem. And there are periods where for years Mosiah is putting out an awful lot of gas and the coffee crops just fail. We've done some analysis of the coffee beans, and you'll be pleased to know that there is no accumulation of some of the nasty heavy metals and so on that come out of volcanic plumes. So Nicaraguan coffee is fine, and it also tastes really good. So that's the good news, but the plants are clearly suffering quite considerably here, so sometimes the crops do just fail. If you have a iron fence or gateways, or your roof is made of corrugated iron, as many people's are in these areas, they are really badly impacted by acid rain, and this has huge economic impact. So it really does matter. It's not something that's going to hit our newspapers, but it absolutely, in terms of the local environment, it's really very important. So this is what Mosiah will look like quite a lot of the time. You may or may not see a little plume like this coming out the top. It's quite easy to think that that's just a cloud, a little fluffy cloud, but it always seems to be in the same place. It isn't just a fluffy cloud. If you've got gas coming out all of the time, sometimes you see it quite easily and sometimes you don't, and that's because of the humidity. And if you have a time where the air is a little bit more humid, then you get the condensation and you see the cloud a lot better. There are times when you just don't see it at all. You would only actually know about it through measurements. So that means that the impact is going on, but you can't actually see the plume too easily. Beautiful view of a sunset across the plume. This isn't cloud, this is all volcanic gas coming out. This is just across the active crater. Here's a couple of shots just to show you what it's actually like inside the crater. You've got a lot of grass in the foreground here, some lava flows. You can't really come and show any pictures in the Geological Society with about a few lava flows, can you? And this is the climb up to the crater area. There's people doing some geophysics in the foreground. I'll talk about it in a little bit. And this is the most recent lava flow that came out of the active crater, the 1670 flow, just spilling out from the crater. Beautiful basaltic lava. You can see it's a few hundred years old, and even out in Nicaragua, it's not really very vegetated. And you would normally expect it to be a little bit more vegetated than that by now, and that presumably is because of the degassing. If you look down into the crater bottom, sometimes you're rewarded with a view like this. This is several meters across. It's not huge, and it's really hard to tell from this picture how deep down the magma is, but it's visible anyway. And this black stuff here is scoria, relatively recently erupted scoria there. So there will have been a strombolian explosion, chucking ash out, and here some of that has landed. So this is what you can sometimes see in the crater bottom, but mostly you see gas. Here's another shot of the very crater bottom. If you can get down onto the crater bottom, when it's not too gassy, this is the sort of thing you'll see, some more lava flows. These are all basaltic, and they're this strange colour because of the gas. So, here's the caldera, here's the lake, and these are this is the active crater here. This is where all of the gas is coming from. This is Masaya town, very, very close to the volcano. Fortunately, it's not, this is the prevailing wind direction going off this way. They do get some of the gas some of the time, of course. They are living very, very close by, and I'll show in a moment where other people are living downwind of the volcano. Managua, the capital city, is about 20 kilometres to the northwest of here. So this is one of the interesting things about well, many volcanoes. Remember, most aren't actually a big pointy peak thing. Many are just a hole like this one, and they're not necessarily round either. If you were drawing if you asked a child to draw a volcano, it would be a pointy peak thing, and probably you would expect the base to be pretty much round. It's an elongated type feature here, and we call that a caldera, which is literally a big crater. It tends to be, if it's over 1 kilometre or so across in any part, then we would call it a caldera, and very rarely are they perfectly round. So these are little craters inside a bigger caldera. Okay, so if we're going to measure this thing and try to understand what it's doing, how are we going to do that? Well, a tried and tested method is to get a PhD student, give him a gas mask, and put the kit on his back and send him off. And a few years later, he comes back and writes up a PhD, job done. And that works terrifically well, but you don't get very much data that way. This isn't staged, this is real, and this is the fly speck here, which is what we measure the sulfur dioxide flux with. But you can't measure a huge amount that way. Many hands make light work. If instead of sending one person with all of the kit, if you get a little bit more kit and you explain how and why to lots of people, then you can get a lot more work done. So this is my approach, or this has been my approach over many years to the work at Mosiah. So here I'm explaining to somebody how a gravity meter works here, and the others have got a GPS receiver here on the top of the tripod. And basically what we do is we have a large number of points all across the caldera at Mosiah, and they're all marked with a little survey pin. And we make whatever measurements there, and we keep coming back year after year after year. And we build up a picture of what is going on, not only in space, as in across the caldera, how there are changes from one part to the other, but also through time, so how those things are changing. So I should dwell just briefly on the gravity meter. I didn't actually bring one with me today because it's too expensive and heavy, but also it looks really unimpressive. It's just a little box, as you can see there, a little white box with a few knobs on the top of it. But it's quite amazing the way that it's so precise. So gravity depends on the distance between two masses. So let's say the mass inside our gravity meter, or us, and the centre of the Earth. So we know that gravity is pulling us down because we're being attracted to the centre of the Earth, and it's about 6,700 kilometres to the centre of the Earth from here. And the other thing that gravity depends on is what those actual masses are, so distance and the actual masses. So we know more or less what the mass of the Earth is. So you would think that if you measured gravity here, it would be what? 9.8 metres per sec squared, something like that. If I measured gravity with one of these instruments on the platform here, and then I measured it again on the floor, which is a few centimetres lower, I would easily, very easily, be able to measure that gravity is stronger, it's higher on the floor there than it is up on the platform. And that's because I'm further from the centre of the Earth up on this platform. So in fact, I should weigh myself up on this platform rather than down there, because I would weigh less, but not within the precision of normal scales, unfortunately. So if you know what the height of the place that you're making measurements is, if you know exactly what that height is and how it changes through time, and you measure gravity at that point and measure it through time, you can correct for any height changes, and then any differences, any residual changes in gravity through time or in space must be due to subsurface changes either through time or in space. So that's the principle of what we're trying to do here, but we use lots of people, and we have volunteers, which is marvellous because they're so enthusiastic, and they are very rarely geologists and geophysicists themselves. They're much more useful than that. Electrical engineers are fantastic for fixing kit for a start, but surveyors and botanists and all sorts of different people, and they're very enthusiastic to carry the kit and go and make measurements in the most obscure places. Anyway, they have a good time. So these are just volunteers having fun in the field, really. Science is great fun making some of these measurements. These are VLF measurements, and I won't have a chance to talk about all of those, but they, over this quite variable topography, you make all these measurements. So I mentioned that we set up points that we need to reoccupy regularly now. We do that with these little marker pins, and that's fine. They do get horribly corroded through time because of the gases. Sometimes we need to protect the instruments a little better, so we built a bunker in the crater bottom, and so we popped a student in there with the instrument just to set it all up. We did let him out again. He looks a bit worried there, doesn't he, as if he's not going to be let out. But we then put a top over that and leave that to record continuously for a period of time. So that was a gravity meter that was recording gravity changes every few seconds. And the idea is to leave that for as long as possible, and to see to see what sort of effects there are over and above those that you would normally expect due to the earth tides and various other things. So if you do that, you get a very detailed picture in one place of how gravity changes, and therefore we can interpret that in terms of subsurface mass changes. So here are some people again out in the field. This is over one of the little pins, making the gravity and the GPS measurements. You can see, although those aerial shots that I showed you made it look like it wasn't very steep, obviously I was lying. It is a volcano. There's more up than there is down, and there's a little bit of up there in the background that you can see. Okay, so after many, many years and lots of volunteers helping us to collect these gravity data, what we've got is, I hope you can just about now recognise the shape of Masaya volcano here. Here's the lake, here are the active craters, and all of those little white crosses are places where we have a very good value of gravity. It's been measured many, many times at each of those points. You can see where the roads are, and you can see where it was easy to go. And you can also see where it wasn't very easy to go, can't you, over long periods of time. But what we've done here, we've got all of those places where we've been able to measure gravity, drape that on top of the topography here, and then the colours show you how the actual value of gravity varies across that region. So think of it a bit like a topographic map, but instead of contours being height, these are contours of gravity. And so in this region, the red bit, it's where gravity is a bit higher than you would expect otherwise. If there was nothing unusual going on underneath this area, there'd be no gravity anomaly, there'd be no colour. The reason we see colour is because there's something making a positive gravity value there and a rather negative in this blue cold area here. So once we've got that, we can start to look at the subsurface structure and try to make some inferences as to what's going on underneath this thing. So just a reminder, here's the caldera, here's the lake, here are the active craters, and we'll take a couple of profiles across there. There's our gravity map. So you remember we had the red bit here, and do you remember that red bit, the relatively high gravity, was actually offset? It wasn't right underneath right on the active craters. Bit weird that. If you thought about what you might expect the subsurface structure of a volcano to be, you might expect there to be some sort of feeder pipe underneath the active crater. You know, gas is coming out, there must be something feeding it, and underneath perhaps there's a magma chamber, blobby thing where the magma all is, and to a first approximation you might draw that as a spherical-ish thing. Well, the gravity data are telling us that, for a start, the anomaly, the positive gravity anomaly means there's a more dense thing underneath that region. The more dense thing will be magma storage region. And it is not immediately underneath the centre of the caldera, and it's not very close to the active crater. So having got this map here, we can model it. And a very, very simple model here is 2 layers across AA and BB here. And this bit here is the magma feeder zone. So you can also see it's not even a disc. It's a sort of an elongated lozenge type shape thing. And its density is about 3 kilograms per metre cubed compared with the surroundings. So it's a higher density than the surroundings and just slightly offset. So now that we've got the broad subsurface structure of the volcano, now that's how we've got our variations in space across the caldera. Now we can look and see how that changes through time. And again, it's done very much the same sort of technique, it's just doing something different with the data. So focusing here on the active crater, you can see those little green crosses. Those are all the points that we measure and we measure and we measure every time we go out there, and then we go back the following year and we measure and we measure and we measure to get the best possible values that we can get for those. And here are the stations in some detail, and the sort of results that you can have from that. Again, pretty colours, but you can see, so this is just an example of between 2008 and 2009, we can see that in the northwest zone here, gravity increased a little bit compared with lower down. Now, the gravity changes are tiny, orders of magnitude smaller, many orders, 3 or 4 orders of magnitude smaller than that big gravity anomaly that I showed you that told us where the subsurface structure was and where the big storage region was. So we've got that structure, and now we're looking at tiny, tiny changes through time. So it's the difference between static and dynamic modelling here. So this is 2008 to 9, 2009 to 10. You can see those same sort of trends going on. So again, we've got an increase in gravity up to the northwest and a slight decrease to the southeast, and pretty much similar trend going on over that period of time. But the active crater is this one here. Weird, eh? The stuff that's moving isn't under the big hole. So, just hold that thought. There's no point just making one set of measurements. There can always be problems, ambiguities in one set of measurements, and any geophysicist will tell you, all you need is one more data point. It'll be fine, I just need one more point, or I just need one more method, and then I'll be fine. We're nowhere even near that, saying that bit yet. We just need lots and lots more. But in order to really interpret our gravity data well, we need to measure the sulfur dioxide flux, which is a lot harder than you might think, because you've got this hole that is 200 metres below where you can even get to, and it's billowing up, and sometimes there's more of it and sometimes there's less of it. It comes up, then gets caught by the wind and goes whooshing down there. How are you going to measure that flux? It's really, really hard. So we do that with the picture that I showed you earlier with Glyn had it on his back. You send a student walking underneath the plume to and fro and to and fro. It's a spectrometer looking up through the plume, and from that you can work out an estimate of the flux, but it's very, very difficult to get accurate measurements. So the numbers themselves are not brilliant. I wouldn't stake anything on any of those, but the trend, I think, is important, and we can believe the trend. So over this period of time, it was decreasing. As I showed you a picture earlier, it looks as though degassing has increased, but we don't have the more recent data ready for that just yet. What is really interesting is that every time the flux seems to go down, there then is some sort of throat clearing episode, very small eruption, locally kind of significant, but in the scheme of things, really not. Throat clearing thing, and then some more gas is able to come out. So usually it's just a case of the vent getting blocked up for a little bit. And so you can see that it could take a number of years where it gets more and more blocked in. It's basically just little landslides going down into this pit crater. And it clears it, and a bit more gas is able to come out. So we don't have enough data to work out what the sort of typical average value is, because you can see how up and down it is. As I say, I think it's increased a bit now, and the longer data set we have, we will be able to come up with each time we'll come up with a better idea of what the actual flux is. But if you put just those slightly dodgy sulfur dioxide flux measurements and the gravity measurements together, you can do something quite good, I think. So through time here, we've got a lot of uncertainty in the gas, which is this blue one, and this is sort of some indication of the potential error here. The gravity has rather less error, but what you can see, albeit rather, well, it's not the most precise thing, but what you can see is general trends. When the gravity goes down, the gas seems to go up. An interpretation of that we published a number of years ago is that the magma level is this red bit here and this gassy bit here can go down. The magma level goes down, which is what you would expect as the value of gravity goes down, because there's less mass beneath you. If you've got a column full of magma, and then the magma goes down, the value of gravity that you measure at the top there will also go down. And so this was a cartoon that we drew some time ago, trying to pull some of these threads together. So this is a cross-section across our active crater. Here are some of the other craters nearby. Here's the hole. So we obviously have to have our magma coming up to the hole there. And the bubbles there are just to indicate regions of vesiculation or bubbly, frothy magma. And remember, we saw that there were movements way away from the active vent itself. They're quite a long way away underneath some of the active other craters and further beyond. So we've got movements and changes going on in a much, much bigger area here. So let's try and put that together with some other information. A colleague of mine, John Murray, pictured here, measured using one of these precision levels. You used to see people on the side of the road making measurements like this. These days they do it with EDMs or GPS, EDMs, electronic distance measuring. This remains the most precise. So you can have a long survey line which you join back, could be many kilometres, tens of kilometres in some cases, and certainly on this volcano it is, and you can close back to well below a centimetre. So the change in height between any of your markers is known to a really very high precision. And John doesn't like to come out to the volcano too often, but he came out in 1994 and he came out this year. And he measured that there was about 8 centimetres of deflation at the summit, so that the active crater area had gone down by not very much, and that really is not very much. Some of the volcanoes that we measure move by centimetres, many centimetres per year. This one took an awful long time to just go down at the active part by about 8 centimetres. So it's not enough to have made a significant difference to our gravity measurements, and the interpretation is similar to the cartoon I just showed you, but perhaps this is a bit clearer to see. In 1994, we know that we could see magma at the surface. So this is perhaps what it looked like. I mean, this is obviously very schematic down here. And now, magma we can't see at the surface, and the ground has gone down a little bit, and that would be consistent with the withdrawal of magma level. But the surface here, exposed to the atmosphere and able to degas, lose its gas from within the magma, is bigger. And so you can actually have more degassing coming out of the lava, out of the magma, even though the magma level is lower. It's not intuitively what you might expect. You might think that if you've got a higher level of magma that you would be able to get more gas out. So this is just a model. May or may not be right, but it's our working model. Well, it's great fun monitoring volcanoes and doing all this stuff, but in a way, who cares? What we really need to understand is what's going on inside the volcano that we can then make a prediction and to help people that are actually living nearby. What is the local impact? So as well as having a good supply of students and volunteers, you need a lot of duct tape. That's the other essential piece of field kit. And what we do is we duct tape these things. The sulfation plates, we just make these up in the lab in Milton Keynes. It's basically just a lead oxide goo, and it's in a little Petri dish, and we duct tape it onto the tree or whatever, and we leave it there for a known amount of time, and it's just exposed to the environment. Take it back to the lab, and we can analyse it for how much sulfur has been, dried deposition of sulfur in here, and chlorine and fluorine and various other things as well. Now, it's not a direct measurement of the flux or anything like that, but it's proxy for those. And if you have lots and lots of these all around the volcano and you keep doing it over a long period of time, you can start to get some idea about the spatial distribution of hotspots, if you like, of sulfur deposition. Do you know, it's amazing how many of these we get through in a field season because people keep nicking them. It's not because, it's bizarre, but we duct tape these up onto trees and in places where nobody should be going, and they nick them. So we, just a little anecdote there, we always have to have about twice as many as you would expect, just because they don't survive, but we're getting a bit smarter about hiding these things. Anyway, having put them all over the place, and here again is our Masaya caldera, here's the lake, and here's the active craters. This is a map that shows how the dry deposition rate changes spatially. So as you would expect, there's this bit here that is broadly consistent with the prevailing wind direction, but it's maybe not exactly as you would expect, because I'm not sure whether you can see the colours clearly enough in here, but it's a bit stripy here. So you actually got a level here where it's not quite so significant, which obviously is good if you happen to be living in that part, because these are all towns. So that's one way of looking at a proxy measurement for the environmental impact, because it tells us something about the amount of sulfur being dumped. But it's quite a pain making these things, and as I say, people pinch them. So how much better to use something for free that's already there? So we have identified the use of tillandsia, which are air plants, and you can buy them here in garden centres, and they're quite expensive. But you can get them for free in Mosiah because they just grow everywhere, and they're marvellous things because they grow on trees. But they also grow on rock. They grow in the most bizarre places because they're air plants, and they get their nutrition from the air, and that's marvellous because that's a bit like, if they do well, that's a proxy perhaps for saying that there's less sulfur. And indeed, that's what we decided to do. So we looked here at so the red dots are places where we made these measurements with the sulfation plates, and looked at where the tillandsia were growing. So looking at this profile here, we can see that there's a pretty neat inverse correlation between the sulfur deposition, so more here, and the number of tillandsia plants, i.e. none. So it's a lot cheaper and more simple, and they don't get pinched, to use tillandsia plants than these things, but what we now need to do is to calibrate them better. So that's what we're in the process of doing at the moment, and being a little bit more sophisticated than just counting the tillandsia, but by looking at their health and their age and their size and so on. So that's the next part of this work. But until we had done this and established this, there was no point in starting that. Now, it may be intuitively obvious, especially since I've been talking about the environmental impact of this volcano, but the number of species that you observe, there's a pretty negative correlation here with the amount of SO2. So again, by mapping the SO2, and now we can do this with tillandsia as well, air plants as well, we can expect the number of species of whatever is growing there to be less in the more gassy areas. And this is illustrated by what we've seen there, and that this again is work that has been done over the last few years by students and colleagues and volunteers in a region of very low SO2. This is typically the sort of range of species that you should have. This is what Mosiah should have in it. So lots and lots of trees and some vines and other bits and bobs. If you get to a region of sort of medium sulfur dioxide exposure, you have many fewer trees. Everything else is more or less the same. Fewer trees and a lot more vines. And then when you get to the regions of high exposure, basically it's only the grasses that survive. So we can look at not only the sulfur and hydrogen and so on with these things, there are some other gases that we can also measure with these diffusion tubes, and so this is a setup of those. And then what we can do is look at those. So we've talked about how they change with space. Now we can look at how they change with time, just as we did with the gravity. Set up a broad map or concept of how things are varying across the caldera and downwind, and then look at how that changes with time. And so you can plot all sorts of different gases and so on. I'm only going to show you the SO2 here, and I think it's probably easier just to look at the two brown curves here, because that's from February 2013 and February 2014, because it's easier and more sensible to compare the same times of year, because there are a lot of other variables once you start comparing the wet season to the dry season and all that. So just looking there, we can see that the SO2 concentration actually increased, was higher in February 14 than it was in February 13. Now we can see that from our measurements, but you couldn't see that from just looking at the plume and guessing. And it's too difficult at the moment to look at the state of the vegetation. There are too many other variables, but what we're beginning to do here is to get a picture as to how the sulfur and other materials from the volcano are being deposited in the local environment, and now we're tying that up with the measurements that we're making about the subsurface processes inside the volcano. And we tie all of those up, and we hope to be able to start talking about predictions. Then we can start saying, for example, last time we saw the geophysics doing this, there was big environmental impact, local environmental impact at this point in time. So you need a long time base in order to be able to see the ups and the downs, and to then say, well, last time I saw something like this, way back then, this is what happened. So then we can start predicting into the future. So this is the beginning of what we're trying to do here. I'll just finish off with some measurements made by Beth Ann Parks, who's a PhD student who has just completed her work. And this was based on the Berg hypothesis, which basically says that if you have a plant, this is a Dalecampia, and is an appropriate one to study, because if you have a plant that has a single pollinator, even if it is really stressed and it's in a horrible environmental condition, unless it's just going to give up the ghost completely and die, it's going to have to keep its reproductive parts exactly the same size and looking pretty much as they should do, because otherwise the pollinator is not going to recognize it and it's not going to come by. And this particular plant is a weird one. It's got this sort of waxy thing here, which is the treat that the pollinator gets for coming along and pollinating it. So what Beth Ann did was make lots and lots of measurements across different parts of the plant and look to see how those measurements, how the sizes of the various bits of the plant varied through space, so across the caldera, whether there was a difference between the plants that were downwind or upwind. And so, being a good scientist, she plotted everything against everything else, but this is an example here. Everything here is plotted against the estimated sulfur dioxide concentration, once again from these plates, and she plotted different things. So this is the length in millimetres of a part of the plant, and different parts of the plant here, and it's a mess, right? There is no correlation. That is consistent with the Berg hypothesis, that it's the plant, however stressed it is, it has to keep the flower bit exactly the same. The only thing that there's a correlation with is the length of the leaf. So that's the bit that it's got more flexibility to mess about with. But it's doing it the wrong way. The higher the concentration, the bigger the leaf. So that's what's going on there. Well, we don't actually know. Science is never finished. I'm not here to tell you the final answers. I'm telling you where we're at the moment. The thought is that, remember I was talking about the gases that come out of the volcano, and we've been so focused on SO2, which was a teeny-weeny amount of the stuff that was coming out. It was mostly water. This is a really hot and dry and nasty place most of the time. If you're downwind of the volcano and you're getting dumped with the plume, if you can cope with the sulfur, the rest of it is all good news. You've got lots more water coming down on you. So that may be the point here. So that in itself is quite interesting, but perhaps more important is if we can start to identify plants that are able to cope with the more sulfurous environment, then we're getting towards potentially genetic modification and so on of crops that are better able to survive in these types of situations. And in some cases, that would be an appropriate way to go for some farmers living downwind of active volcanoes that are persistently active in this way. So just a final picture, because I don't want you to ever forget Mosiah. It's such a wonderful place. Here's the lake. People do swim in it, and you've got to wonder why. when you see the Mosiah town is up here and the sewage works are right on the bank there, and there's a beautiful waterfall comes from the sewage works down into it. So we've got our big caldera here, which is a national park, and our active crater here. And much of this, although it's a bit up and down, it is quite accessible. So I should really set this as an exam, but I will give you the answers, even though I hopefully have told you. So I asked the question right at the beginning, what do volcanoes have to do with climate? And we looked at some bigger eruptions, all relatively recent though. The answer is it depends on how explosive the volcanic eruption is. If it's very explosive and the material goes up into the stratosphere, then it can start to go global. And if there's enough of it, and it's going to stay for any length of time, which it tends to once it's gone stratospheric and there's a lot of it, it can remain there for years. And then you can begin to have measurable changes in temperature. So what do volcanoes have to do with the local environment? Well, I think the answer so far is that depends on the type of vegetation that you have there. A persistently active volcano is going to be putting out a lot of water, but it's also putting out sulfur dioxide and some other nasties. And it's not all bad news, is the answer on that one. Why did we look at Masaya volcano? Well, obviously, it's a fantastic volcano to go and study. It's a great thing. But the important thing about it is that we know that it has had several cycles of degassing over a number of years, over hundreds of years. And unlike many geological phenomena, over a geophysicist's working life, there are significantly measurable things going on. So it's something that you can expect over 5, 10, 15, 20 years to be able to make measurements on. So that's really why Mosiah. So what next? Well, earlier this year we noted that the gas flux looked like it was increasing. We're still working through those data. The suggestion is that the magma level is quite low at the moment. And so what we really need to do is to keep measuring that, see whether it goes up or down or whatever. But now we've started to have these measurements of flora, look to see now how they move with time, how they change with time. We've got some idea about the space changes, but not so much in terms of time. And if I haven't completely put you off Mosiah Volcano, do join me. I should be going there in February, and I'm always looking for volunteers to help me. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Hazel, for that fantastic talk and for giving us a glimpse into some proper geoscience as it's really done and sharing work in progress with us. Because as you say, normally you don't get to the end point and have the answers.
There is no end point.
It's fantastic to actually hear about this work going on and the hypotheses that you're coming up with. So thank you for that. We've got a little bit of time for some questions. So who has there's lots of questions. I'll try and get to as many of you as I can. So let's start with the gentleman right at the back there.
Thank you for your presentation, Hazel. I was just wondering if anybody had done any investigations into effects on human health of being present in the sulfur plume downwind.
That's a really good question. Yes, they have. And one of the difficulties is a long-term monitoring of that sort of thing. And there are an awful lot of ethics forms and things that you need to fill in, and you need to be an expert in such things. So it's not something that I'm going to be able to do, but there are people interested in doing that, and I very much hope that we can collaborate with them. What we do know is that downwind of some volcanoes, you do hear that there are increased incidences of asthma, but also skin irritations. And what we need to do is to join these things up with a long-term measurement of these things to see whether it's an immediate response or whether it's something, it's a sort of chronic background thing. So we need to do it.
Okay, let's take a question just about that.
Thank you. Do you measure the vertical temperature gradient of the surface, which might tell you how close the magma is?
No, we don't measure the vertical temperature gradient. What colleagues of mine in that enormous list of cast of characters at the beginning, people have been looking at the self-potential, which is effectively you put a couple of electrodes in either side of wherever you want to, and there are natural currents in the ground which tells you about the water, and you can measure the temperature of fumaroles and that sort of thing. But to measure the magma is too far down, really, to be able to actually measure it. What you can do is look at the infrared radiation coming from it when it's exposed at the surface, and you can see that. But the assumption is that because we know where the magma chamber or the big storage area is, and that's quite offset from the craters themselves, we've got these cartoons for a relatively shallow area, but you wouldn't be able to drill down to those, I don't think. I mean, they would be quite far down.
I would just thought over a metre, if you look at the temperature difference in fractions of the group, it might tell you the heat flow.
Yes, it would tell you. It would tell you about the heat flow. You're absolutely right. It would depend an awful lot on the water movements there, and they might mask anything. But yes, absolutely, you could do it, and obviously it gets hotter as you go down.
And why is it offset?
Well, that's a really good question. Well, the big one, the big model that I showed you, the one I showed you first, which showed the huge storage area, may not even be the magma that has supplied the present Masaya area. Maybe we haven't even seen that yet. It might be something that was feeding something before Mosiah was there. So that could be why. It's always very tempting to see something at the surface, measure something below and say, well, obviously they're connected. Now, they're not immediately on top of each other, but there's nothing else immediately obvious underneath there. So that might be one reason. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's take a question right down the front, please, Sarah. Sorry, I should have said at the beginning, if you wait for the microphone to come to you, these lectures, of course, are recorded.
I want to widen the context a bit. You've told us some very interesting things about how this process works, and we're very grateful to you. But I just want to mention that you mentioned Mount Pinatubo and its effects, but throughout the history of life on Earth, this kind of thing has had enormous effects. And I just wondered whether you could say something to us about those things. I mean, for example, at the end of the Permian and the beginning of the Triassic periods, you find that almost certainly it was the volcanic eruptions which caused the extinction of over 90% of life on Earth. Then you've got more recently, you've got Laki in Iceland, which contributed to the French Revolution. You've got the year without a summer following the Battle of Waterloo. There's a whole risk of things. Some of them possibly caused by hits from space, but quite a lot of them caused just by volcanic emissions. And I think it'd be very helpful to us all if you could talk a little bit about that.
You are absolutely right. Volcanoes have shaped the Earth and they have shaped life, and that's absolutely right. Most of the big mass extinctions that have happened in the past do seem to coincide in time with massive eruptions, and they tend to be these large flood provinces. So they're massive eruptions of basaltic lavas, and huge amounts of gas coming out and causing terrific climate damage. And it's the climate change that has caused these mass extinctions, in some cases almost completely wiping out all life as we've known it. Some of those are really quite clear, and they seem to coincide in time with the eruption, and so we think that there's a cause and effect, and that's fine. There are some more recent ones, so you mentioned many, but the KT boundary, which is the dinosaur one, is a really interesting one, because there we know there was a volcanic eruption going on in the Deccan Traps, and we also know that there was a great big meteorite landed. And the difficulty here is that the dating is getting better and better, and we're getting better and better at doing that. But of course, the meteorite landed one day. The volcanic activity went on for a much longer period of time. And the evidence at the moment seems to be that there was a terrific amount of climate forcing because of the ongoing volcanic activity in the Deccan Traps in this particular case. And climate change was really well underway, and many species were becoming extinct, had already gone extinct. We then had this massive meteorite, which was really the straw that broke the camel's back, and the Earth didn't recover very quickly from that. Maybe it would have recovered more quickly, maybe it wouldn't. We don't know. But that's an interesting one, because we have the two combined there. That's not the case with all of them, but with some of them they are. Broadly, the reasons are the ones that I showed for Pinatubo. It's the gases going up into high up into the stratosphere, and in some cases slightly lower, but there just being so much that it's going on and on and on, and it starts to go right around the globe, and it's then that you start to get global changes and that lead to these mass extinctions.
Well, thank you for that. I just point out that the one that happened at the end of the Cretaceous was just a few yards away from the volcano you've been studying. That is to say, it hit Chicxulub in Mexico.
That's right. Just
there, and it's just a few 100 kilometers from your volcano. So these things work together.
Right,
Cause and effect.
Let's take one more question, another one down the front here, Sarah.
Well, I'm going to try and put two in if possible. Firstly, what about mercury fluxes, and are they significant? And the second one is, I'm a botanist by training, and do you notice any ecotypes of plants growing there? Because over a period of time, they could well have adapted to these unusual conditions.
Mercury flux is being measured by another group, not by me. we do know that mercury is quite a good indicator. It gives you a pretty good insight into subsurface structures that you wouldn't see otherwise, particularly faults. So you can almost map faults by mapping the mercury. I don't know of work being done at the moment on that at Mosiah, though. Well, I'm not a botanist by training, so I think I might just dodge that question, but it was really interesting that in Beth Ann's Viva, she was the student who measured the Delacampia, various bracts that she was looking at there, and there was a question about whether there was some adaptive, because this volcano has been erupting like this for hundreds of years, it is quite possible that there is an adaptation of that. Now that's another research project. That's the next student perhaps, but you know, it's really interesting having identified this unique species of butterfly just in that little crater, and it's quite amazing to me how rapidly you could have these changes. I wouldn't have thought that evolution, I mean, it's a bit plate tectonics you think of being as a fast process, and depending on which time scale you're looking at. And evolution is something that I've always thought of as taking a very, very long period of time, and I think your question suggests that it can be quite quick. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question from a gentleman whose hand keeps shooting up towards the back, and then we must let everyone go and have a nice drink afterwards. Sorry, Roy, you've already told your microphone. I was misleading.
I did have a question which was answered earlier, but one which occurs to me, do you know if similar degassing volcanoes have been monitored elsewhere, and if so, are they getting similar results to yourself?
Well, as far as I know, there isn't another survey, long time series like this. Lots of people make measurements of particular volcanoes, and you can have some very detailed measurements for a period of time, but then not again, which is some of the data that I showed early on looked at the SO2 measurements from a range of volcanoes. Of course, those numbers were great for the period that they were taken. What you don't know is whether next year it was the same or not. So, yeah, lots of people are measuring gases, absolutely, but an integrated study like this over such a long period of time is, as far as I know, not being done elsewhere.
Is that because the conditions, is it possible to compare them? Is the variations too much to give a credible result?
Well, why don't other people do it? Because it's tricky to keep going back to the same place for 20 odd years. You know, I mean, you need either a volcano observatory whose job it is to do that sort of thing, and usually funding and various other things mean that long-term measurements like that aren't made. If they are, it's one or two things being measured, not the number that we're now trying to make. You're right, there is a huge amount of variability, and as in any science, the error bars are often very large, and the hope is that they aren't much bigger than the signal most of the time, but that is why we're trying to compare so many different types of data together, so that, I think I mentioned earlier, we're looking particularly at the trends rather than the specific numbers.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for your questions. I'm sorry to those of you who didn't get to ask your question. It's an indication of the fantastic, fascinating lecture that we've had, that there were so many questions, but we've made Hazel do this twice today. So I think that she certainly deserves a nice glass of wine. So please come and join us for a drink, and join me again in thanking Professor Hazel Ryan.